Here's the technique that I use to not worry about making mistakes when I'm sketching on a canvas. What I like to do is I use acrylic markers to sketch first. So there are many advantages to sketching with these instead of with like a pencil. For example, they're available in a wide range of tones and colors. Sketching in a light color does a number of things for me. For one, I'm not worried about making mistakes. I could just leave a line anywhere. And it's not really that dark. You can see right here, that barely shows up. This is kind of like a rough sketch. And once it gets too like fuzzy looking and you want to make some corrections, you go to a darker color. So you can draw over the top of it with like this Raw Sienna or whatever. And notice I'm not worried about getting marks on here. Erasing is like taking a step backwards because you're undoing your work. Drawing with multiple light colors allows you to keep moving ahead while using parts of the previous lines as guidelines. When I draw with multiple light colored markers, I could just keep drawing and not worry about making mistakes. And that's because I could just draw over it with a darker marker. Now you might be thinking, well, I could just sketch with a brush, but there's many benefits to these markers. One is they dry quickly and they're waterproof when they're dry. And the Liquitex markers contain the same pigments they put into their paints. So they're going to match the paints that you have, and they're also light fast. Another brand is Posca. They use acrylic paint within these markers, and they have a finer point than what the Liquitex do. You can see that comes to a finer point than the Liquitex markers. So here's the chisel tip on a Liquitex marker. One thing to keep in mind is you don't want to use like a solvent-based marker like a Sharpie, because that can actually bleed through your paint. A lot of the dye-based ones, even after the paint dries on top of it, it will bleed through. So you really want to make sure that you're using like an acrylic-based marker that's made for painting. Posca works, so does Liquitex. You can also buy your own empty paint marker tubes and fill them up with the type of acrylic paint that you want to. What color you use is kind of a personal preference. I'm using neutral gray 8. If you want something warmer, parchment's pretty good too. Another option is just to start with the Raw Sienna or a burnt sienna. Try a few different colors and see which one you like best. To use these markers, you want to shake it up, there's a ball in there. And to get the ink flowing, you just press the tip down. I have this reference photo of the asparagus, and I'm not at all worried about making mistakes. I'll start with the horizon line, and I'll just sort of like indicate where the asparagus lands on the table. It slants downwards like this. And notice, I really don't care about making mistakes. I can draw on this all day long. And I'm not going to get into the shapes too much on the inside until I know I have this placed right. So here's the edge of the table, and the rubber band, let's see if I can figure out where that is. It's about there. And I would say maybe about here. One of the benefits of using these markers over using a brush with thinned out paint is you don't have to reload it. In order to reload this marker, you just press the tip down and it barely takes any time at all. Plus you don't have to squeeze any paint out onto your palette. It's always ready to go. And if I were starting with a pencil, I don't know if I'd be this far along. I have most of this laid out. I can start working on the interior shapes of this asparagus bunch. There's some point in your drawing where you have too many lines down. And it's hard to make corrections unless you erase something. And if you ever tried erasing pencil on a canvas, it's not very easy. And paint isn't that easy to wipe off either, especially if it's acrylic. The cool thing about the markers is, once you have too many lines down, you just switch to a darker color and reinforce the lines you think are right. It's a lot like how illustrators would use a blue pencil to do a rough sketch, and it'd be real hairy. And then when they were certain they had it right, they would ink the lines that they liked. And they would just leave those blue lines in the background because the camera wouldn't pick it up. This is a very similar concept. I have most of the lines down and the basic shapes are established. Now I want to go back in and maybe correct a few of the lines. And for that, I'll use a different color. This is Raw Sienna, and you can tell it's darker than the light gray that I was using. So you can see a lot of this over on the side here. It's a little bit fuzzy, and I want to like reinforce some of these lines. So if you look at this, you might be thinking, well, which line would I follow when I paint this? And that's why I go in with another color. And notice how you can see that brown over that gray fairly easily. That's the one benefit is when I'm going in with this darker marker, it's not like I'm drawing in like this blank white space. I already have like these guidelines to use as a reference. So my marker is getting a little dry. I just press the tip down and that's it. And right here, I can see the negative shape, which is the shape that surrounds the object. And I'm drawing that instead of like thinking about drawing the asparagus. I noticed maybe this comes out too far, so I can just draw this line here. I've got this mostly sketched out and I'm pretty happy with where it is now. Like I can base a painting on this. If it was more complicated and I needed to make more corrections, that's easy. You just use a darker color. So this is burnt umber, and see how easy that is to see over the top of this raw umber? It just makes it real obvious. I could put a couple of indications of like where the shadows are. And if you wanted something darker, you could just use black. I'm going to set up the Sta-wet palette with these Liquitex soft body acrylics. I bought the 12 color set. I don't think I'm gonna lay out all the colors, but I could probably use at least half of them. I'll just take the lid off. You just squeeze them out as if it's a regular palette. So here's yellow. Naphthol red light. Probably don't need a lot of that. I just need to make the green more neutral. Ultramarine, phthalo green, and a bunch of titanium white. When I normally work with regular acrylics, they dry out on the palette and I have to use a spray bottle. But when you use a wet palette, it should draw the moisture up from the sponge and keep it wet while you're working, and even when you put the lid on it overnight. For this painting, I'm going to test out the Princeton polytip brushes. What's different about them is the ends of them are kind of frayed, so there's more surface area to pick up paint. I'm going to do a time lapse while I paint out most of this. I'm just going to mix up some of the colors and get started. I let these acrylics sit in the Sta-wet palette for a week and they're still wet. Even these thin areas of paint are still wet. And of course the thicker areas like this red are still good too. I only rinsed the sponge out once to prevent mold. I have an entire video about how to set up a Sta-wet palette. There's a link to it in the description below. I've also been testing out this Masterson Rinse Well. It's convenient because when the water gets too dirty, you can just press the blue button to flush it and refill it with fresh water. Up next, you can watch my video about how to set up and use a Sta-wet palette, or my video about how to enlarge drawings onto a canvas using a projector.